Aircraft approaching. Many formation. All hands. Battle stations. Sound the alarm.
June 4th, 1942. The Pacific before dawn is calm, almost deceptive. A low wind brushes across the steel decks of Japanese warships as crews move quietly, practiced, alert. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy is expected, but not like this. Then the radio traffic begins to change. Reports arrive in fragments. Bearings, altitudes, numbers that do not seem to fit together. Lookouts raise binoculars toward a sky that is slowly turning gray. What they see first are not ships, but shadows. Long, spreading formations. Engine noise building into a continuous roar. Not a strike, a tide. Wave after wave appears, rising from the same direction, layered in depth and height. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Hundreds of aircraft launched not from one deck, but from many, moving together with mechanical precision. This is not the scattered carrier warfare the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained to defeat. This is something else entirely. Officers hesitate, recalculating assumptions formed years before the war began. The sky itself has become a weapon, and in that moment, it is no longer clear whether mastery of the sea still belongs to battleships, skill, or courage. What is something far larger and more impersonal now unfolding above them? That realization did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of years of doctrine, belief, and misjudgment forming beneath the surface of the war. Long before aircraft filled the skies over the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built its identity around decisive battle. This idea, rooted in late 19th century naval theory and reinforced by Japan's victory over Russia in 1905, held that wars at sea would be settled by a single, climactic clash between battle fleets. Speed, precision, and morale would determine the outcome. The aircraft carrier, though useful, was not yet the final arbiter of naval power. During the interwar years, Japan invested heavily in naval aviation. By the late 1930s, its carrier pilots were among the most skilled in the world. They trained rigorously, often flying more hours than their Western counterparts. Japanese naval planners understood carrier operations earlier than many of their rivals, and they integrated air power into fleet tactics with sophistication. Yet even this progress existed within limits. Carriers were seen as instruments to soften an enemy before the true battle began, not as platforms capable of independent, sustained dominance. This thinking shaped how Japanese commanders interpreted the future war. They expected engagements to be sharp, violent, and brief. Aircraft would strike first, weakening the enemy's battleships and carriers, allowing surface forces to deliver the decisive blow. Numbers mattered, but only to a point. Quality, coordination, and spirit were believed to compensate for industrial disadvantage. When war broke out in December 1941, early results seemed to confirm these assumptions. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated what concentrated carrier air power could achieve against an unprepared opponent. 6 Japanese carriers launched a carefully timed strike that crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single morning. In the months that followed, Japanese naval aviation dominated vast areas of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Allied forces were pushed back repeatedly. Carrier raids struck with precision, speed, and apparent inevitability. But these successes masked structural realities. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized limited, highly coordinated strikes. Launching and recovering aircraft was complex and time-consuming. Deck cycles were rigid. Aircraft were rearmed and refueled in carefully sequenced phases, making rapid mass relaunches difficult. Losses among trained air crews were irreplaceable, and pilot training pipelines were slow by design, prioritizing elite standards over scale. Underlying all of this was an assumption about the enemy. American naval aviation, Japanese planners believed, would lack cohesion. The United States had fewer experienced carrier pilots at the start of the war. Its doctrine appeared cautious. Pre-war exercises suggested American carriers would operate independently, not as coordinated groups capable of delivering overwhelming force in a single moment. Japanese intelligence noted U.S. industrial capacity, but doctrine, not factories, shaped expectations of how battles would unfold. This belief extended to aircraft production itself. Japanese planners knew the United States could build more planes, but they assumed time would limit the effect. Carrier warfare, they believed, was too technical, too specialized to be industrialized quickly. Deck crews, pilots, maintenance, all required long, careful preparation. Quantity alone could not create effectiveness. Yet beneath the surface, a different war was already forming. American shipyards were expanding. Aircraft factories were reorganizing around mass output. Training programs were shifting from elite cultivation to systematic throughput. And perhaps most importantly, U.S. naval thinkers were re-examining how carriers could fight, not as lone raiders, but as components of a larger, synchronized system. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered 1942 confident in its experience and methods. Its commanders expected to face American carriers, but in familiar ways: limited strikes, staggered attacks, manageable waves. What they did not anticipate was the transformation of carrier warfare into something closer to industrial artillery delivered from the air. That transformation would soon test every assumption Japan had carried into the war. While Japanese carrier doctrine matured within the boundaries of experience and tradition, the United States approached the problem from a different direction. American naval aviation before the war was uneven, cautious, and often underestimated. But it possessed one advantage that doctrine alone could not replicate: the ability to change rapidly when necessity demanded it. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy did not merely repair ships and replace losses. It restructured how carrier warfare was conceived. Pre-war exercises that once emphasized conservative carrier operations were reevaluated in light of wartime realities. Carriers would no longer operate as solitary hunters. They would move together, sharing air cover, coordinating strikes, and concentrating force at decisive points. This shift was inseparable from American industrial capacity. Aircraft production accelerated at a scale unprecedented in military history. Factories that once produced civilian aircraft were converted to wartime output. Standardization replaced craftsmanship. Aircraft such as the F-4F Wildcat, SBD Dauntless, and TBF Avenger were designed not only for performance, but for ease of maintenance, rapid repair, and mass training. They were tools meant to be used in numbers. Equally critical was the transformation of training. American naval aviation abandoned the pre-war emphasis on producing a small cadre of elite pilots. Instead, it built a pipeline. Flight schools expanded across the continental United States. Training syllabi were standardized. Pilots graduated in waves, competent rather than exceptional, supported by a growing system of replacement crews. Losses, though costly, could be absorbed without crippling operational capability. At sea, carrier operations were reorganized around efficiency. Deck handling improved. Launch and recovery cycles became faster and more flexible. Radar, still primitive, offered early warning that Japanese forces lacked in comparable form. Communications between ships improved, allowing commanders to manage multiple decks as a single striking arm rather than isolated platforms. The concept of the Fast Carrier Task Force began to take shape. Carriers were grouped with cruisers, destroyers, and support ships into mobile formations capable of sustaining operations far from base. Rather than waiting for the enemy to approach, these forces sought contact, delivered strikes, and withdrew before counterattack. Most importantly, they could launch large numbers of aircraft in coordinated waves, not once, but repeatedly. Japanese intelligence observed these developments only in fragments. Reports noted increasing American air strength, but the scale was difficult to grasp. The idea that multiple carriers could synchronize launches to send hundreds of aircraft into the air within a narrow window ran against Japanese operational experience. It required not only ships and planes, but logistics, training depth, and a tolerance for mechanical loss that Japan did not possess. By early 1942, both navies were moving toward confrontation, but with radically different expectations. Japanese commanders believed they would draw American carriers into a decisive engagement where skill and experience would prevail. The Americans, though still learning, aimed to apply pressure through overwhelming air power, exploiting numerical advantage wherever possible. These two visions collided in the Central Pacific. There, doctrine met reality in a matter of hours. The moment American carriers began launching aircraft, not as isolated strikes, but as mass formations, the nature of the war at sea shifted decisively. And when those formations rose into the sky, the shock was not simply tactical. It was existential, a recognition that the enemy had learned to turn industry itself into a weapon. That realization would be fully understood only when the first waves appeared on Japanese radar screens and through Japanese binoculars, growing larger instead of smaller. The first angle through which the moment must be understood is human. On the decks of Japanese carriers and escorts, the sight of massed American aircraft did not immediately translate into panic. It produced something quieter and more dangerous: hesitation. Officers had trained for enemy strikes, but not for scale beyond precedent. Reports of incoming aircraft had always carried a ceiling. This time, that ceiling dissolved. Pilots waiting near their aircraft listened as updates arrived faster than they could be processed. Bearings overlapped. Altitudes conflicted. Numbers were revised upward again and again. Men who had survived months of combat in China and the early Pacific felt the difference instinctively. This was not a raid. It was sustained pressure applied from the air with an industrial rhythm. The emotional anchor was not fear alone, but the erosion of certainty. The second angle is technological. Japanese carriers were masterpieces of naval engineering, but they were designed around rigid operational cycles. Aircraft were armed and fueled on enclosed hangar decks, then brought up to the flight deck in precise sequences. This system allowed for careful coordination, but it lacked elasticity. Once committed, a carrier could not easily pivot. A delayed launch, a disrupted recovery, or a sudden need to rearm aircraft exposed dangerous vulnerabilities. American carriers, by contrast, operated with greater deck flexibility. Aircraft could be parked, cycled, and launched with fewer constraints. This did not make them invulnerable, but it allowed for faster response. When multiple American carriers synchronized their operations, the effect multiplied. One deck's delay did not halt the strike. Another carrier compensated. The sky filled anyway. The third angle centers on leadership. Japanese Naval Command had produced brilliant tacticians, but brilliance was often concentrated in individuals rather than systems. Admirals, such as Isoroku Yamamoto, understood the strategic risk Japan faced. Yet the structure beneath them was slow to adapt. Orders flowed downward through layers of command, shaped by doctrine that prized precision over speed. In rapidly evolving air battles, this became a liability. On American carriers, decision-making was increasingly decentralized. Air group commanders had authority to adjust timing and targets. Task force commanders coordinated rather than dictated. This allowed mass launches to proceed, even when conditions shifted. Leadership became less about perfect timing and more about maintaining momentum. The fourth angle is psychological, and it cut deeper with each passing minute. Japanese pilots had entered the war believing themselves superior in skill and spirit. Early victories reinforced that belief. Facing hundreds of aircraft did not immediately disprove it, but it rendered it insufficient. Skill could defeat an opponent. It could not erase numbers. Even successful interceptions felt temporary when new formations appeared behind the first. Defensive fire thinned some waves, but the sky did not clear. It replenished. The realization was gradual and devastating. The enemy could afford losses that Japan could not. Each American aircraft destroyed represented training, material, and time, but not finality. For Japanese defenders, every engagement carried an unspoken calculation of attrition that no longer favored them. The fifth angle is operational. Carrier warfare had shifted from duel to system. Japanese doctrine still framed engagements as sequences of actions. Locate, strike, assess, strike again. The American approach compressed those steps. Locate and strike merged. Assessment became continuous. Mass launches allowed pressure to be maintained while earlier waves were still engaging the enemy. There was no clean pause, no clear reset. As these realities unfolded, Japanese commanders attempted to respond within familiar frameworks. Aircraft were recalled, rearmed, delayed, relaunched. Each adjustment introduced friction. Decks became crowded. Timelines slipped. Vulnerability increased, not because of incompetence, but because the environment had changed faster than doctrine could follow. By the time the scale of American carrier operations was fully understood, the battle was already moving beyond any single decision. The human, technological, and leadership pressures were converging, narrowing options with each passing minute. What remained was the confrontation itself, the moment when theory met irreversible action. From the American side, mass carrier launches were not conceived as a spectacle. They were a solution. Early encounters in the Pacific had revealed a harsh truth. Piecemeal attacks invited defeat. Isolated squadrons were intercepted, scattered, and destroyed by experienced Japanese pilots. Survival depended on concentration, not only of firepower, but of time. American carrier commanders learned quickly that the sky itself could be saturated. Fighters could protect bombers if they arrived together. Dive bombers could overwhelm defenses if they appeared in numbers. Torpedo planes, once disastrously vulnerable, could survive if enemy fighters were already engaged elsewhere. Mass was not excess. It was insurance. This operational philosophy reshaped planning at every level. Strike packages were assembled with deliberate imbalance. More aircraft than strictly necessary, accepting redundancy as strength. Losses were anticipated, not feared. The goal was not perfection, but inevitability. Something would get through. This enemy perspective was invisible to Japanese commanders in the moment. What they saw were waves without context. What they could not see was the confidence behind them. The knowledge that follow-up strikes were already forming, that decks were already cycling again, that failure in one sector did not doom the whole operation. Psychologically, this realization fractured long-held beliefs. Japanese naval culture emphasized decisive superiority achieved through preparation and spirit. The concept of sustained, impersonal pressure conflicted with that ethos. Air combat had always been personal, pilot against pilot, skill against skill. Mass carrier warfare replaced that intimacy with volume. Individual excellence mattered less than systemic endurance. Pilots began to sense this shift even as they fought. Interceptions felt endless. Ammunition ran low. Fuel margins tightened. Aircraft returned damaged only to be turned around again, while new enemy formations approached. Fatigue accumulated faster than damage could be repaired. The emotional toll was cumulative, not dramatic. There was also a moral dimension, subtle but unavoidable. Japanese doctrine had prized sacrifice, yet it assumed sacrifice would produce decisive results. Facing an enemy that could absorb losses without slowing forced a grim reassessment. Sacrifice alone could no longer guarantee meaning. It became expenditure. On the American side, distance from this moral weight was created by scale. Pilots understood risk, but the system did not hinge on any single individual. Crews flew, landed, refueled, and flew again within a machine designed to keep moving regardless of individual outcome. This was not cruelty. It was industrial war, stripped of sentiment by necessity. The enemy angle also reveals a deeper asymmetry. American commanders were prepared to learn in combat. Mistakes were recorded, analyzed, corrected. Japanese command structures were less forgiving. Failure carried stigma. Adaptation, when it occurred, was slower and often constrained by tradition. This difference mattered most when facing a rapidly evolving form of warfare. As mass launches continued, Japanese responses became reactive rather than anticipatory. Aircraft were launched to meet immediate threats rather than to shape the battle. Initiative slipped quietly, without a single dramatic moment. Control eroded not because of defeat in one engagement, but because the tempo had shifted beyond reach. The moral weight of this shift settled unevenly. Japanese sailors and pilots faced a future where courage remained essential but insufficient. American forces faced a war where success depended on sustaining momentum rather than achieving finality. These opposing realities converged in a single point of no return, the moment when massed aircraft did not merely arrive, but struck with irreversible effect. That moment would define the battle not by surprise, but by transformation. The decisive moment did not arrive with a single explosion. It unfolded across minutes that felt longer than they were, measured in bearings, altitudes, and incomplete reports. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Japanese carriers were already engaged in a complex sequence of actions, recovering aircraft from earlier missions, refueling, rearming, recalculating targets. The decks were crowded. Hangars were full. Ordnance lay exposed. Then the sky closed in. American carrier task forces, operating beyond Japanese detection for critical hours, had completed what Japanese planners believed impossible. Synchronized mass launches from multiple decks, timed to converge almost simultaneously. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, torpedo planes from Hornet, fighters spread above and ahead. Aircraft filled altitude band from sea level to high above the cloud layer. Japanese radar, limited and unreliable, offered little warning. Visual sightings came too late to form a coherent response. Fighters were launched, but in fragments. Combat air patrols climbed through confusion, engaging threats piecemeal rather than as a unified screen. The first American torpedo squadrons arrived low and slow. They were met by intense anti-aircraft fire and aggressive Japanese fighters. Losses were catastrophic. Entire squadrons were cut down, but their presence fixed Japanese defenses at low altitude. Fighters were pulled downward. Guns tracked targets near the waves. Above them, unseen for crucial minutes, American dive bombers continued their descent. At approximately 10:20 a.m., the geometry of the battle collapsed inward. From high altitude, SBD dauntless dive bombers rolled into near-vertical dives. Sunlight flashed off wings. Sirens wailed as pilots aligned their sights. Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were caught at the worst possible moment. Aircraft were fueled. Bombs and torpedoes were staged for rearmament. Fire suppression systems were unprepared for multiple simultaneous hits. Bombs struck flight decks and penetrated into hangar spaces. Fires ignited instantly. Explosions cascaded through enclosed compartments. Aircraft became fuel-fed weapons. Within minutes, carriers that had represented the core of Japanese naval aviation were transformed into burning wrecks. Damage control teams fought with discipline and courage. Flooding was countered. Fires were attacked. But the scale overwhelmed effort. Heat intensified. Smoke choked passageways. Communications failed. Command posts lost clarity. The carriers were not sunk immediately, but they were functionally dead. The shock was not confined to material loss. Japanese commanders now faced a reality that could not be reversed by tactical brilliance. The American carriers had delivered not a single strike, but a decisive saturation attack. Even as damage reports flooded in, new American aircraft were already returning to their decks, preparing for subsequent operations. The moment marked more than the loss of ships. It marked the collapse of an operational assumption that carrier battles would unfold in controlled sequences, allowing adjustment and response. Instead, mass launch had compressed decision-making into seconds and punished delay without mercy. The fourth Japanese carrier, Hiryu, would strike back later that day with determination and skill, inflicting damage on USS Yorktown. But even this counterblow carried the imprint of imbalance. It was brilliant, yet isolated. It could not restore the lost carriers, the lost pilots, or the lost initiative. As smoke drifted across the Pacific, the turning point settled in quietly. The Japanese Navy had not merely lost a battle. It had encountered a form of warfare it could not match in scale, speed, or sustainability. What followed would confirm that this moment was irreversible. By early afternoon, the battle no longer resembled a contest between equals. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers in a matter of minutes had torn a hole in the Imperial Navy's operational center. What remained was not cohesion, but effort, disciplined, determined, and increasingly isolated. Hiryu, the lone surviving Japanese fleet carrier, launched its counterstrikes with precision. 2 separate waves found USS Yorktown, damaging her severely and forcing temporary abandonment. These attacks demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation, when given opportunity, remained lethal. Skill had not vanished. Courage had not diminished. But the context had changed. Hiryu was operating alone, without layered protection or mutual support. Her air group was finite. Each aircraft lost could not be replaced during the battle. American carriers, by contrast, remained part of a system. Damaged ships covered by others, strike groups redistributed, decks cycling continuously. The American response was decisive and unrelenting. Once Hiryu's position was located, mass launch doctrine asserted itself again. Aircraft were assembled rapidly, drawn from multiple carriers. There was no pause to consider perfect conditions. Timing favored momentum. The strike launched while Japanese crews were still recovering their own aircraft. Late in the afternoon, American dive bombers descended on Hiryu. Bomb hits ignited fires similar to those that had destroyed her sister ships. Damage control efforts slowed the inevitable, but by nightfall, Hiryu was crippled beyond recovery. She would be abandoned and later scuttled. With her loss, the Japanese carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor ceased to exist as an effective entity. The immediate tactical outcome was clear, but the deeper turning point lay in what could no longer be achieved. Japan had entered the war with a finite pool of elite naval aviators. Midway consumed a disproportionate share of them. Experience accumulated over years was lost in hours. Training pipelines could not replenish this loss quickly, if at all. American losses, though significant, were absorbed. Pilots were replaced. Aircraft were replaced. Carriers damaged but not sunk were repaired and returned to service. The system flexed and continued. Doctrine collapsed quietly. Japanese planners could no longer assume air superiority in carrier engagements. The idea of luring the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle under controlled conditions became increasingly unrealistic. From this point forward, Japan would fight defensively, reacting to American movements rather than shaping them. Equally important was the psychological break. The shock of mass carrier launches lingered beyond the battle itself. Reports circulated within the Japanese Navy describing overwhelming numbers, unending waves, and attacks that arrived faster than they could be countered. These were not exaggerations. They were descriptions of a new reality. American commanders, for their part, recognized what had worked. Concentration of carriers, redundancy in strike groups, acceptance of loss as the price of saturation. These principles would be refined, expanded, and applied repeatedly in the months and years to come. Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, but it ended parity. From that point forward, every major carrier engagement would be shaped by the same imbalance. One side able to generate mass at will, the other struggling to respond within shrinking margins. As the sun set on June 4th, 1942, burning carriers marked the water with oil and flame. The battle's noise faded, but its implications grew louder with time. What followed was not recovery, but consequence, measured in strategy, production, and the changing psychology of an entire war. In the days following the Battle of Midway, the scale of loss became fully visible. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Along with them vanished over 300 aircraft and, more critically, a large portion of Japan's most experienced naval aviators and deck crews. These were not numbers that could be replaced by mobilization alone. They represented years of accumulated skill, coordination, and institutional memory. American losses were severe but asymmetrical. USS Yorktown would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine days after the battle, but her air group had already been evacuated. Aircraft losses, though heavy in certain squadrons, were replenished. Pilots lost at Midway were mourned, but the system continued to produce replacements. The disparity was not emotional, it was structural. Strategically, the Japanese Navy was forced into a defensive posture it had not anticipated so early in the war. Plans for further expansion into the Central and Eastern Pacific were abandoned. The concept of drawing American carriers into a controlled, decisive engagement under Japanese terms was quietly shelved. Instead, Japan began constructing layered defensive perimeters, hoping to slow the American advance long enough to regain balance. The shock of mass carrier launches extended beyond Midway itself. Japanese naval reports analyzed the battle with growing unease. The speed with which American carriers assembled, launched, and recovered large strike packages challenged long-standing assumptions about operational limits. What had once seemed constrained by deck space and human coordination now appeared scalable. This realization influenced subsequent Japanese carrier operations. Greater emphasis was placed on dispersal to reduce vulnerability, but dispersal reduced striking power. Attempts to improve pilot training were constrained by fuel shortages, aircraft scarcity, and time. The war no longer allowed for deliberate refinement. It demanded throughput, which Japan could not sustain. For the United States, Midway validated an approach still in evolution. Carrier task forces were expanded, standardized, and refined. The lessons learned about concentration, redundancy, and tempo became doctrine. Later battles would involve even larger formations, with carriers launching hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves across multiple days. The immediate aftermath also revealed a shift in naval psychology. Japanese commanders became cautious, aware that exposure meant annihilation. American commanders grew increasingly assertive, willing to press operations deeper into contested waters. Initiative, once shared, now tilted steadily toward the United States. Yet Midway's aftermath was not defined by celebration or despair alone. It marked a transition. The war entered a phase where victory would be determined less by individual brilliance and more by sustained capacity. The ability to generate force repeatedly, adapt faster than the enemy, and accept loss without collapse. As the Pacific settled into uneasy quiet, both navies prepared for what came next. For Japan, it was a struggle to hold ground. For the United States, it was the beginning of forward momentum. That momentum would soon test whether mass carrier warfare was an anomaly or the new permanent shape of the war. As the war moved beyond Midway, The consequences of mass carrier warfare deepened rather than diminished. What had shocked the Imperial Japanese Navy in a single battle became a recurring condition of the conflict. American carriers did not merely replace their losses. They multiplied. By late 1942 and in 1943, new fleet carriers entered service in steady succession. Each carried larger air groups, supported by improved logistics and increasingly refined doctrine. Task forces grew not only in size, but in resilience. A damaged carrier could withdraw while others continued operations. Air power, once concentrated in a few decks, became distributed across many, reducing vulnerability while preserving mass. Japanese attempts to counter this shift were constrained at every level. Shipbuilding lagged behind losses. Aircraft production struggled to keep pace with attrition. Pilot training programs shortened, producing aircrews with less experience and fewer flight hours. Quality declined not through negligence, but through necessity. The war demanded numbers Japan could not provide. Carrier engagements after Midway reflected this imbalance. At battles such as the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, Japanese forces fought with determination and tactical skill, inflicting damage and suffering losses. But the underlying pattern remained unchanged. American carriers absorbed damage and returned. Japanese carriers, when hit, were often lost permanently. The ability of American forces to launch hundreds of aircraft at once became routine rather than remarkable. Fast carrier task forces struck islands, airfields, and shipping with sustained intensity. Air superiority was established through volume, maintained through rotation, and reinforced through constant replacement. The sky became an extension of American industrial capacity. For Japanese defenders, the psychological impact compounded. The expectation of brief engagements gave way to endurance battles they were ill-equipped to fight. Defensive strategies emphasized attrition, hoping to make advances costly enough to slow momentum. But attrition favored the side that could afford it. By 1944, the disparity reached its peak. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation suffered catastrophic losses against American massed air power. The engagement became known among American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a grim reflection of how far the balance had shifted. Hundreds of aircraft were launched and recovered in continuous cycles, overwhelming what remained of Japanese naval aviation. From that point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed the means to challenge American carrier dominance in open battle. Operations became increasingly defensive, then desperate. Mass carrier launches were now one-sided. Not a shock, but a certainty. The long-term aftermath of this transformation extended beyond the Pacific. Naval powers around the world observed the outcome. Battleships, once symbols of national power, were relegated to support roles. Carrier aviation emerged as the decisive instrument of maritime warfare. For Japan, the loss was not only territorial or material. It was conceptual. The war had moved beyond the framework within which its navy had been built. Adaptation came too late and at too great a cost. As American carrier formations continued to advance westward, their presence alone reshaped the battlefield. The sound of engines overhead no longer signaled a single attack, but an ongoing condition. And within that condition lay the final lesson of the war at sea, one that would resonate long after the guns fell silent. The Battle of Midway and the shock of mass carrier launches marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but in naval history itself. What had once been measured by the skill of individual commanders, the bravery of a few pilots, or the weight of armored hulls now depended on systems, scale, and endurance. Industrial capacity had become a weapon, and the sky, once a theater of isolated duels, became a vast battlefield shaped by numbers and rhythm. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the lesson was stark and unavoidable. Expertise and courage could not substitute for production lines. Tactics and doctrine mattered, but only when they operated within the constraints of sustained capability. A single brilliant strike could no longer define a campaign. The loss of carriers and veteran aviators in mere hours revealed that wars would be won not only by fighting well, but by fighting repeatedly, efficiently, and relentlessly. For the United States, the events demonstrated the power of integration between ships, aircraft, personnel, and industry. Mass launches were more than a tactical innovation. They were an expression of systemic adaptability. The human effort was amplified by the machinery of war, creating outcomes that could not be achieved by heroism alone. Yet the story is also human. Behind every aircraft in those waves, behind every command decision, there were individuals confronting fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. The enormity of massed operations did not erase human cost. It magnified it. The courage of Japanese sailors and aviators, the resolve of American crews, the weight of choices made in the heat of battle, all these formed the heartbeat beneath the statistics. Ultimately, the battle marked the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. Battleships ceded supremacy to carriers. Air power became decisive. Doctrine evolved alongside industrial might. And the psychological reality of facing an opponent who could deliver hundreds of planes into the air at once reshaped strategy, morale, and expectation across the Pacific. Midway teaches that warfare is never static. Each technological advance, each doctrinal refinement, each organizational change can redefine what is possible. The shock felt by the Japanese Navy was more than tactical. It was a warning that the future belongs to those who can harness scale, speed, and adaptability without losing sight of the human effort that drives it. The echoes of that morning, when hundreds of aircraft darkened the horizon, continue to define how the world measures naval power and the limits of human endurance at war.